Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, I want to share the harrowing experiences from my brief stint as a night patrolman at Blackwood Cemetery, an ancient, brooding stretch of land that feels as though it's been forgotten by the light. I worked the 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. shift, a time when the veil between the living and the dead feels thinnest. The cemetery officially closed at 7 p.m., but the atmosphere at Blackwood began to shift long before that. As the sun dipped below the jagged line of old pine trees, the air didn't just get colder, no, became heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. My routine was to drive slowly along the winding dirt paths, my headlights cutting through the gray mist to ensure no visitors remained behind. One evening, as the fog began to crawl over the base of the headstones, I spotted a tall, gaunt figure standing near the eternal mausoleum. This was a massive, windowless stone structure, tower over 20 feet high and completely solid. I pulled my car alongside to remind the visitor of the closing hour, but in the split second it took for me to step out and shut my car door, the figure was gone. The sidewalk was bone-chillingly empty. There were no footsteps, no rustle of grass. When I ran around to the back of the structure, the only thing I found was a pocket of air so frigid it felt like it froze the breath in my lungs, and a silence so absolute it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. The real dread, however, escalated during my mandatory midnight sweep. The cemetery was pitch black, my headlights the only thing standing against a darkness that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. As I rounded a sharp curve, my beams caught something crossing the path just 10 feet ahead. My brain froze as it tried to process the image. It was a pair of human legs, clad in tattered trousers and worn-out shoes, walking with a casual, rhythmic stride. But from the waist up, there was nothing. No torso, no head, just empty space. Every time a foot hit the pavement, it made a sickening wet thud that echoed through the silence. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The legs stopped dead in the middle of the road. They slowly pivoted, turning the toes of the shoes toward my car, as if the entity was staring at me through eyes that weren't there. Then, it simply continued its walk into the darkness of the old graves. I threw the car into reverse, performed a panicked U-turn, and raced back to the office. That same night, my patrol scanner, a rugged piece of equipment, was found crushed, as if a pair of invisible hands had squeezed it into scrap metal. The climax of the horror, though, was the dream. Or perhaps it wasn't a dream at all. I had fallen asleep in my car, and I woke to find myself completely surrounded. Dozens of dead faces, gray and peeling, were pressed tight against the glass of every window. They wore rotting burial clothes. Their eyes were hollow pits of shadow, and their teeth were bared behind skin that had long since withered away. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching me like I was a specimen in a display case. When I finally jolted awake, drenched in a cold sweat, I found faint, misty handprints lingering on the outside of the glass. I quit the job the very next morning. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that wet, rhythmic slap of the legs that had no body, and I can still feel the weight of those dozens of dead eyes watching me from the shadows of Blackwood. Good evening again, friends. If you thought the vanishing lady near the mausoleum was enough to keep you awake, this next experience is far more intimate. It's one thing to see something impossible from a distance. It's another thing entirely when that impossibility reaches out and touches you. Back then, I was stationed at Iron Gate Heights, a sprawling hilltop cemetery known for its Gothic ironwork and the wind that whistled through the gravestones like a dying breath. My partner at the time, Alara, was a saint. She knew I couldn't leave the grounds during my shift, so every night around 8 p.m., she'd brave the winding, unlit road to bring me a hot meal and some much-needed human conversation. I never told her about the shadows I saw dancing at the edge of my vision, or the muffled, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from inside the newer vaults. I wanted her to feel safe. I wanted one part of my life to remain untouched by the rot of that place. One Tuesday, the air felt different. Thick, static heavy, and smelling faintly of wet copper. When Alara arrived, she seemed jumpy. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror of her car, claiming she felt like someone was following her up the hill, even though the main gates were locked behind her. We ate quickly in the front seat of my patrol car, the heater humming a low, mechanical tune that failed to drown out the oppressive silence of the heights. When it was time for her to leave, I walked her back to her car, which was parked near a row of weeping willows. The moon was a jagged sliver of white, casting long, skeletal shadows across the grass. Just as she reached for her door handle, she froze. Her hand shot up to the back of her head, clutching her ponytail, and she whirled around with a look of pure, frantic confusion. "What is it?" I asked, my heart beginning to sink with the frantic thudding in my chest. "A branch," she whispered, though her voice was trembling. "I must have cut my hair on a stray branch." I looked up, and a cold sweat broke across my neck. I pointed toward the willows. The nearest tree, its branches drooping and lifeless, was at least 30 feet away. There wasn't even a bush within reach. The space around her was a vacuum of empty, freezing air. Alara's face didn't just go pale. It turned a sickly, translucent white in the moonlight. Her eyes went wide, reflecting a terror I hadn't seen before. She began to shake, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as she described the sensation. It wasn't just a snag. She told me it felt like a heavy, freezing palm had pressed against the back of her neck, and then long, invisible fingers had slowly, deliberately interlaced themselves through her hair before giving her ponytail a sharp, violent tug. The way she described it, the weight of the hand, the coldness of the touch, made it clear this wasn't some stray breeze or a trick of the nerves. Something that wasn't there had physically claimed a moment of her time. She scrambled into her car, fumbling with the keys as if her life depended on it. She didn't say goodbye. She just sped toward the gate, the tires screaming against the gravel. She never brought me dinner again. In fact, for years afterward, she refused to drive past Iron Gate Heights even in the broad daylight. I can't blame her. To this day, I still wonder what that thing wanted and why it chose her to send its message. Good evening, all, and welcome back to the darkness. For this third account, I want to talk about a man I'll call Silas and the disturbing decline I witnessed during my time at Graywood Memorial Gardens. While I worked the lonely hours of the night, Silas held the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. slot, but there was an off-putting quality to him that seemed to thrive even in the midday sun. At Graywood, we had a strict and, in my opinion, heartless policy. We were required to remove personal items left at grave sites, toys, cards, and mementos, to maintain a uniform appearance. I hated this rule and refused to enforce it. I couldn't bear the thought of tossing a child's favorite doll into a dumpster. But Silas? He didn't just enforce the policy, he treated the cemetery like a high-end thrift store. It started with small things Silas thought had value, vintage coins or silver lockets. But soon, his greed turned into a bizarre, obsessive form of scavenging. He began taking items that had no monetary worth: a weathered teddy bear, a single ceramic earring, even half-burnt prayer candles. He would stuff these tokens into the deep pockets of his heavy work coat. As he walked, you could hear the constant hollow clack, clack, clack of stolen memories bumping against his legs. As the weeks went by, Silas began to change in ways that defied logic. He stopped leaving when his shift ended at 4 p.m. I would arrive for my night watch and find his battered truck still idling in the shadows of the weeping oaks. He would be out there, deep in the oldest section of the gardens, wandering aimlessly while drinking heavily from a flask. He became detached and erratic, his movements jerky and unnatural. His skin took on a gray, waxy sheen, shockingly similar to the weathered marble of the headstones he was supposed to maintain. He looked less like a living man and more like something that had been unearthed. One night, I saw him standing over a fresh grave, his pockets so heavy with stolen trinkets that he stood with a painful, hunched posture, as if a physical weight was crushing his spine. When I called out to him that night, he didn't turn his body. He only twisted his neck, further than a human should, and stared at me with eyes that were flat and soulless, like polished river stones. Then came the day he simply stopped showing up. When my boss finally checked Silas's small cabin on the outskirts of the property, he didn't find a man. He found a nightmare. The tiny shack was filled from floor to ceiling with thousands of stolen items. But the most chilling detail was this: every single object, every toy, every letter, every locket was covered in a thick, wet layer of fresh cemetery soil, despite being kept indoors. It was as if the earth itself had followed Silas home to reclaim what he had taken. Silas was never heard from again. I often wonder if those stolen items finally grew too heavy for him, and the mark he left behind was simply an empty space where a thief used to be. Good evening, everyone. For this fourth account, I want to take you back to a time when I thought I was in control of my fear. I was working at a sprawling ancient burial ground known as Raven's Hollow. After the disappearance of Silas and the strange occurrences during the week, I had picked up an extra Saturday morning shift to help make ends meet. The morning was deceptively peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels like the earth is holding its breath. By 10 a.m., the exhaustion of the night shifts finally caught up to me. I drove my patrol car behind the St. Jude's cloister, a crumbling stone structure tucked into the far corner of the grounds. The cloister was surrounded by a wall of yew trees, nearly 15 feet high, which created a secluded, sun-dappled pocket of absolute isolation. It felt like the safest place in the world for a quick 20-minute nap. I fell into a sleep that felt unnaturally heavy, like being pulled underwater. When my eyes finally drifted open, I was still in the driver's seat, but the sunlight had turned a sickly, bruised gray. Then I saw them. My car was completely besieged. Every single window was obscured by faces, pale, stagnant, and impossibly close to the glass. There were dozens of them, men and women packed so tightly together that I couldn't even see the yew trees beyond them. The horror wasn't just in their numbers, it was in the details. They were dressed in their Sunday best, Victorian-era suits with high, stiff collars and lace burial dresses that were filthy, yellowed with age, and torn in jagged patterns. Some had their jaws wired shut, a common practice in old-world embalming, yet their eyes were wide and filled with a frantic, silent intelligence. One man, his face in an advanced stage of gray decay, had his forehead pressed so hard against the windshield that I could hear the faint, sickening sound of skin sticking to the glass. None of them moved. They didn't tap on the glass or try to get in. They just stood there in a suffocating, absolute silence, watching me as if I were a specimen in a jar. The air inside the car grew freezing, and I realized I could no longer hear the birds or the wind, only the sound of my own panicked, shallow breathing. I jerked awake for real this time, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sun was bright, the yew trees were swaying in a gentle breeze, and the glass was perfectly clear. But the experience hadn't felt like a dream. It lacked the blurred edges of a normal nightmare. It was too vivid, too grounded in the physical reality of that car and that cloister. I looked at the window where the decaying man had been. There, in the thin layer of morning dust on the outside of the glass, was a faint, oily smudge in the shape of a forehead. I didn't wait for a second warning. I put the car in gear, drove straight to the main office, and handed in my keys. I called my supervisor and quit on the spot. I realized then that at Raven's Hollow, you are never truly alone, even when you're behind closed doors. Good evening, everyone. This next story takes us back to the autumn of 2016. I was 17 at the time, living in a suffocatingly strict household in North Yorkshire where even the mention of Halloween was considered a sin. I had spent every October watching other children from my window, feeling trapped by rules I didn't choose. But that year, I had Leo, my first real boyfriend. He was my escape, the person who promised me my first true taste of freedom. We were invited to a massive Halloween party about 40 minutes away. Neither of us could drive, so we convinced Leo's older brother Eris to take us. Eris was a cynical guy. He refused to wear a costume, and only agreed on the condition that we paid for the fuel and didn't expect him to participate in any idiotic rituals. Leo and I went as a Victorian ghost couple, pale makeup and tattered lace, while Eris just wore a dark hoodie and a scream mask pushed back on his head. The party was a hazy blur of cheap cider and loud music. But the real trouble started when a group decided to trek to Highgate Hollows, an ancient, neglected cemetery down a winding country lane. By the time we reached the gates, the rest of the group had bailed. Some got sick, others found a pub that was still serving, leaving just Leo and me. The air was bone-chilling, a damp North Yorkshire cold that seemed to seep into your marrow. The streets were empty, lit only by the occasional flickering street lamp that struggled against the absolute blackness of the moors. When we reached the cemetery gates, my stomach did a slow, sickening flip. The iron bars were locked tight with a heavy, rusted chain, so we climbed over a collapsed section of the stone wall near the woods. Inside, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just a lack of noise. It was an active, heavy stillness that made every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. We settled under a massive skeletal oak tree that bordered the dense forest. Leo, trying to be funny, pulled out a ghost hunting app and started mocking the dead, asking for a sign. "Did you hear that?" he suddenly whispered. I thought he was messing with me until I saw his face. He was deathly serious. Then I heard it too, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps circling us in the dry leaves. We stood up, our phone torches cutting pathetic slivers of light through the dark. That's when we saw it. A figure, darker than the night around it, standing perfectly still, just a few yards ahead. It didn't have a face, just a void where features should be. As we stood frozen, I felt a sudden icy sensation on my bare arm, like long, thin fingers grazing my skin. I screamed, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. The shadow figure vanished as soon as we looked back. Then, right in our ears, came a deep, guttural growl. Vicious, aggressive, and undeniably non-human. We bolted, stumbling over uneven graves in the pitch black. As I scrambled to climb back over the stone wall, the hem of my lace dress caught on a jagged piece of iron and ripped. I reached back to grab it, but something else snatched it first. Leo and I watched in absolute horror as the torn fabric of my dress appeared to float upward, hovering in midair as if held by an invisible hand. Then, with a violent, aggressive force, it was slammed down into the mud. We ran until we saw Eris's car idling on the road. He'd come looking for us after the others returned to the party. "You both look like you've seen a ghost," he laughed, but we were shaking too hard to explain. As we drove away, I tried to convince myself it was the cider and the atmosphere, but then, without warning, the car lurched to a violent halt. Eris swore something had lunged across the road. While the boys got out to check the engine, I looked at the back window. There, pressed firmly against the glass from the outside, was a perfect, frosty handprint. I screamed for them to get back in. When Leo sat down, he looked at his hand and turned even paler. Clutched in his palm was the jagged piece of lace from my dress, the piece we had seen slammed into the mud 50 yards back inside the cemetery walls. It hadn't been in his hand 5 minutes ago. We never spoke of it to Eris again. He still thinks it was a prank, but Leo and I, now married, still have that piece of lace stored in a box. It's a reminder that some things in the hollows don't just watch you, they reach out and take a piece of you with them. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. This next story is one of those that lingers in the back of your mind every time you find yourself driving down a long, unlit stretch of highway in the early hours of the morning. It's a reminder that sometimes the darkness doesn't just hide things, it manifests them. It was early March 2024. My friend Elias and I were driving back from a late-night music gig, hauling a trailer full of gear through the winding, heavily forested back roads of the Pacific Northwest. We were exhausted, fueled only by stale coffee and the hum of the tires against the asphalt. The area we were in was notorious for its dead zones, miles of logging roads with no cell service, no streetlights, and absolutely no signs of civilization. Around 3:45 a.m., I realized I had missed the turnoff for the main highway about 5 miles back. The road we were on, locally known as Ghost Pine Road, felt like it was narrowing, the ancient evergreens pressing in on us like the walls of a tunnel. I slowed the truck down, looking for a spot wide enough to pull a U-turn with the trailer. I finally found a gravel turnout near an old, rusted gate. As I shifted into reverse and swung the truck around, my high beam swept across the tree line and then centered on the pavement directly in front of us. Standing on the shoulder, barely 5 feet from the edge of the asphalt, was a man. He was tall, wearing a heavy, dark gray canvas jacket and mud-stained work pants. But there was something fundamentally wrong with his posture. He was perfectly upright, as stiff as a board, staring directly into the blinding glare of our headlights without blinking. As soon as the light hit him, he began to move his right arm. It wasn't a wave for help or a hitchhiker's thumb. It was a stiff, mechanical motion, his arms snapping up and then slamming down toward the ground, over and over, as if he were frantically signaling for us to stop immediately. The speed of his arm was unnatural. It was too fast, too rhythmic, like a piece of broken machinery. Elias gasped, "Is he hurt?" But as we got closer, we saw his face. It was a mask of frozen, waxen stillness. No emotion, no mouth movement, just those snap-action arm movements. I didn't stop. Every instinct in my body screamed that if I opened that door, I wouldn't be the one coming back to the truck. I slammed my foot on the gas, the trailer fishtailing slightly as we roared past him. In the rearview mirror, I saw him continue that violent, downward waving motion until the darkness swallowed his silhouette. Neither of us spoke for a full 5 minutes. The dashboard clock read 3:52 a.m. Finally, Elias whispered, "He didn't have any gear. No car, no flashlight, just standing in the blackness." My pride and a lingering sense of guilt eventually got the better of me. About 2 miles down the road, I convinced myself it might have been someone in genuine distress. We turned back around. We drove slowly, our phone torches and high beams illuminating every inch of the shoulder. We reached the exact spot, the same rusted gate, the same gravel turnout. The road was empty. There was no man. More importantly, when we got out to check the soft, muddy shoulder where he had been standing, there were no footprints. The mud was smooth and undisturbed, except for the fresh tracks of my own tires from 2 minutes prior. There was nowhere for him to hide. The woods there were thick with thorny underbrush that no human could have sprinted through in 60 seconds without leaving a trail of broken branches. I don't know who or what was signaling us to stop that night on Ghost Pine Road, but sometimes I wonder, if I had stopped, would I have seen what he was trying to warn us about? Or would I have become part of the warning itself? Good evening again, everyone. This 7th account is one that still makes my skin crawl when I look through old digital photos. It involves a place on the absolute fringes of my hometown known as Blackwood Ridge. To even get there, you have to navigate a labyrinth of decaying logging trails, cutting through miles of suffocating marshland on a narrow dirt track until you reach a small, ancient tree line that chokes the entrance to the burial grounds. The rumor among us teenagers was always about the Watcher, a figure said to mark the cars of those who stayed too long, ensuring they'd never find their way back out of the marsh. Naturally, that kind of talk made it the ultimate destination for a midnight adrenaline rush. When I first heard of Blackwood Ridge as a freshman, the curiosity was gnawing at me. My father, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, but had a healthy respect for the dangers of the swamp, only agreed to let us go if he came along in his own truck, fearing we'd get stuck or run into trouble. We finally found the site using old GPS coordinates. It was late, the kind of darkness that feels like it's physically pressing against your eyes. I took dozens of photos on my phone, the flash illuminating the crooked, moss-covered headstones for a split second before the shadows rushed back in. It wasn't until we were driving away that I started scrolling through the gallery. My heart didn't just drop, it felt like it stopped. In one photo, taken near the center of the ridge, you can clearly see a figure, not just a shadow, but something waxy and distorted, leaping toward the camera. If you zoom in, the face is a nightmare. The features look like they were melted and then pulled tight, and there are two other faces peering out from the high grass behind it. That photo still gives me a visceral sense of dread every time I see it. Fast forward 3 years. My friend Sarah and I were bored on a humid Midwestern summer night and decided to test our luck one last time. We followed the dirt road through the marshes, the tall grass scraping against the sides of the car like skeletal fingers. The road felt longer than I remembered, twisting into a dark void. Suddenly, the car didn't just stall, it died. The engine cut, the headlights flickered and vanished, and even the digital dashboard went completely black. It was a total electrical failure, something that had never happened to that car before. We were stranded in the dead zone. It was 11 p.m., pitch black, and we had 0 cell service. The silence was the worst part. There were no crickets, no frogs, just the sound of our own panicked breathing. As we sat there, I felt a heavy, crushing sensation of being watched from the tree line. After what felt like an eternity of us sobbing and fumbling with the ignition, the car suddenly roared back to life on its own, the radio blasting static at full volume. We fled back to the main road without looking back, but as the adrenaline began to fade, we checked our location. We realized with a collective shudder that the car hadn't died randomly. It had lost power exactly 15 feet away from the hidden, overgrown entrance to Blackwood Ridge. It was as if the place had been reaching out, trying to keep us there just a little bit longer. This next account is one of those experiences that fundamentally changes the way you look at the world around you. For me, it happened in a small, fog-heavy town in Maine called Whispering Pines, where our family home sat just a stone's throw away from the ancient Willow Creek Cemetery. During the day, the place was deceptively serene, nestled beside the Kennebec River with massive weeping willows and maples casting long, peaceful shadows over the mossy headstones. I used to cut through the grounds constantly, seeking a shortcut to the water or just a bit of quiet. Before I turned 18, the idea of the supernatural never even entered my mind. That changed one sweltering summer evening when my best friend, Julian, and I decided to head down to the riverbank for some late-day fishing. To reach our favorite spot, we had to traverse the heart of the old cemetery. As we crested the final slope leading to the water, we both stopped in our tracks. Someone was already there. He was an older man, dressed in a way that felt entirely out of time. A flat wool cap, a faded flannel shirt, and a heavy fishing vest with countless pockets that looked stiff with age. Because of the steep, muddy slope of the bank, we could only see him from the waist up. He was standing perfectly still, staring out at the water. We decided to approach him to see if he minded us fishing nearby, but as soon as we scrambled down to the edge of the bank, the man was gone. The river was shallow and calm. There was nowhere for a person to dive or hide in those few seconds it took us to reach the spot. Julian's face turned a sickly shade of white, and he started stammering words I couldn't even make out. I stood there frozen, trying to process how a man we had seen as clearly as day could simply vanish into thin air. Terrified, we abandoned our gear and sprinted back to my house. My parents were away for the weekend, leaving the large, creaky house entirely to us. We were sitting in the living room, doors locked and lights blazing, trying to rationalize what we had seen, when a faint sound drifted from the far side of the hallway. It started as a low, melodic humming, which gradually shifted into a high-pitched whistling. It was a slow, mournful tune, an old melody that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Neither of us dared to go check. We just sat there, paralyzed, as the whistling circled the outside of the room. The night took its most terrifying turn when we heard a deafening roar of white noise coming from the garage. My stepdad kept an old, bulky CRT television out there, one of those heavy units with a manual dial. It had powered on at full volume, blasting nothing but blinding static. We eventually worked up the courage to go out and turn it off, but when I reached for the power cord to rip it from the socket, my blood turned to ice. The cord was coiled neatly on the floor. The TV wasn't even plugged into a power outlet, yet it continued to scream with static until the screen finally flickered and died on its own. In the weeks that followed, the garage became a place of dread, with the TV occasionally bursting into life in the middle of the night until my stepdad finally hauled it to the landfill. Since that summer, I've caught occasional glimpses of shapes in the Willow Creek Cemetery, figures that dissolve the moment I try to focus on them. But nothing has ever unhinged me like that fisherman by the river. Whatever I saw that day was real, and it followed us home. This next account is one that has stayed with me for nearly 15 years, resurfacing in my mind whenever the air grows still and heavy. At the time, I lived in a quiet corner of Virginia, just a stone's throw from the Ashwood Hollow National Cemetery. It was a place of solemn beauty, with endless rows of white headstones that seemed to glow against the rolling green fields, all lined by towering ancient oaks. I used to spend a lot of time exploring the grounds. During the day, it was peaceful, almost calming, and I found myself drawn there more often than not to clear my head. But Ashwood Hollow had a dark stain on its history that every local knew about. Decades ago, the caretaker, a man named Elias Thorne, had been found murdered in the cellar office of his own home on the property. The details were grisly, and even though time had passed, the story lingered over the house like a cold fog. One humid Tuesday afternoon, I decided to take my usual walk along the familiar paths between the graves. As I drifted closer to the old caretaker's house, the atmosphere began to shift. The birds, which usually filled the oaks with their chatter, had gone completely silent. The air felt stagnant, charged with a strange tension. I started to feel a strong, unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't just a vague discomfort, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my back. I slowed my pace, scanning the dark, glass-paned windows of the house, half expecting to see a pale face staring back from the shadows of the parlor. The house was quiet, the doors were shut, and there was no sign of life. Yet the feeling only intensified. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn toward the stone steps that led down to the basement entrance, the very doorway that led to the office where Elias Thorne had met his end. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was simply playing tricks on me because I knew the history of the cellar. That's when I heard it. It started as a low, rhythmic buzzing in the distance, sounding almost like the hum of a massive electrical transformer. As I stepped onto the first stone stair, the sound grew into an intense, vibrating drone that seemed to rattle my very teeth. It filled the air, thick and suffocating. When I reached the bottom step, I froze. The basement door wasn't just dirty, it was completely, physically covered in a black, pulsing carpet of flies. There weren't just a few. There were thousands upon thousands of them, layered on top of one another. They were clinging to the wood, the rusted frame, and the stone walls, their wings vibrating violently as they tried to force their way through the cracks into the cellar. The air around the entrance seemed to ripple with their movement, and the smell was unbearable. It was thick, sickly, and metallic, the unmistakable scent of something that had been rotting in the dark for far too long. I stood there paralyzed, staring at the mass of black bodies as they swarmed the entrance to the place where a man had bled out years before. Every instinct in my body screamed that I was standing on the threshold of something that did not belong in the world of the living. My heart raced and my stomach twisted into knots as a wave of pure, primal fear washed over me. I backed away from the steps slowly, never daring to turn my back on the house or that humming door. I didn't stop until I had reached the main path, and even then, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the doors swing open or a figure watching me from the high windows. The cemetery eventually returned to its silent state, as if the swarm had never existed. But I knew what I had seen, and I never went near that house again. I still can't explain why those flies were there, or why they were so frantic. All I know is that standing there, knowing the history of that cellar, it felt like the house itself was alive, and it did not want me there. This final account is perhaps the most unnerving, as it reminds us that some things don't just haunt cemeteries. They wait for us on the lonely stretches of road in between. My partner Sarah and I have a habit of taking late-night drives to unwind, exploring the winding back roads of the Ozark Mountains just to see what the darkness might reveal. Most of the time, these trips are peaceful, filled with the eerie beauty of abandoned barns and forgotten valleys. But what happened last October, during the height of a bruised, copper-colored harvest moon, changed our perspective on the night forever. We were navigating a narrow, two-lane road that cut deep through the dense forest, miles from the nearest town. The darkness in the Ozarks is different from the city. It's an absolute, suffocating blackness that feels like it's pressing against the windows. As we crested a steep hill, my high beams suddenly illuminated a shape on the very edge of the pavement. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch or a trick of the mist, but as we drew closer, the shape resolved into the silhouette of an elderly woman. She was slightly hunched over, wearing a long, heavy coat that looked out of place for the season. There were no houses for miles, no porch lights, and she carried no flashlight or phone to signal her presence. My immediate thought was that she was a local resident suffering from dementia who had wandered away from home. I slowed the car to a crawl. "Do you see her?" I whispered to Sarah, who nodded, her eyes fixed on the figure. As we came within 30 feet, a cold, primal dread began to seep into my chest. Her posture was wrong, stiff and mechanical, as if she were being held upright by invisible wires. Then, she slowly turned her head toward the car. When the headlights hit her face, Sarah let out a sound I will never forget. There was no face. Where there should have been a nose, eyes, and a mouth, there was only a smooth, pale expanse of skin stretched tightly over a skull-like frame. It looked like a mannequin carved from wet, grayish flesh rather than plastic. As we stared, the skin began to ripple. It was subtle at first, like something was moving just beneath the surface, trying to push its way out. A thin, jagged crease appeared where a mouth should be, but there were no lips, only a raw, slit-like opening. Her eyes were nothing more than dull, gray pits that didn't reflect the light of our headlamps. The skin continued to shift and rearrange itself, a grotesque attempt to mimic a human expression that failed with every twitch. She didn't reach out or move toward us. She simply stood there, her head following the car with that blank, featureless stare as we passed. The adrenaline finally surged through me, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The engine roared and we shot forward, the tires kicking up gravel as we fled down the winding road. In the rearview mirror, I could see her still standing on the shoulder, her hunched silhouette perfectly still under the dim, bruised moon. Neither of us spoke until we reached the lights of a gas station 20 miles away. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "That was not a person," she said. I could only nod in agreement. When we got home, we couldn't sleep, replaying every sickening detail of that shifting, waxy face. I later searched for any folklore that matched the encounter, finding mentions of the Naperabo, a faceless spirit from Japanese legend. But those stories are usually set thousands of miles away. This was in the heart of the American wilderness. We didn't take a picture. The only thing on our minds was getting away from that thing. But it saw us, and I know that whatever was standing on that road is still out there, waiting in the dark.